My name is Dylan. I'm an artist, curator, dancer, and museum worker, as you just heard. And before I begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today. I want to acknowledge that this has been a site of knowledge transfer for generations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In this talk, as you heard today, I'll be looking into my model for a utopian museum foregoing object-based collections to reduce impacts on climate change. Thank you. So this talk is really inspired by my experiences first off as a ceramicist and the wasteful practices that we have in ceramics, from energy-intensive kiln firings to the formation of permanent artifacts which are then destroyed. In this case you see the red bin in the middle. It really got me interested in the life cycles of objects and where they end up. So, this has changed. So, reflecting on my experiences in a variety of museums around Sydney, I really got to see the back end of conservation and registration practices. So from bubble wrap to Tyvek to frozen Olympic mascots, which are in these massive vaults to prevent them from degrading, it really got me thinking about the intense practices that we have to protect these objects. At the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, it has a collection of 500,000 objects, but only 3 to 5% are actually on display at any time. So with that in mind, I want us to sit first with this statement. So for today, I'll be going through 3 questions. First off, what is a museum without a collection? Secondly, why should we have a museum without a collection? And thirdly, what is the role of a curator in this sort of museum? So to help me out with what is a museum without a physical collection, I wanted to reference Dr. Amarazzo Gala and his comments at the Intangible Cultural Heritage and Museum Project in the 2020 symposium. He mentioned how museums have a tendency to freeze in time living heritage through curated displays, and as a result, they form these narratives of self and other, and also makes us think about as it once happened in the anthropological past. I think museums should have a different definition. I think museums should be a site for tacit learning where we have hands-on experiences in communal settings and the collection of primary data. In here, what we have, I wanted to think about, for example, museums as dance studios to transfer the practice of whacking. So in this case, whacking being a dance style set to underground disco, which originated in the gay clubs in Los Angeles amongst Black and Latino communities. However, a lot of the originators passed away due to the AIDS epidemic. And with the loss of documented histories, it made me think about how the whacking community could have been benefited with museums and that support that we have. I also thought about Haha Vegan doing a demonstration at Simma, which was an exhibition curated by Nanette Worley at the Murray Art Museum, Albury, earlier this year. If we had museums as cooking studios, where we could exchange meals, exchange knowledge, what kind of ramifications would that have? So if we go into the kind of ramifications of this, let's try and break this down into how a museum operates. So on the left might be kind of a typical museum with collections, how it's organized, and on the right, we start to see that exhibitions and designs disappears completely. And instead, that's because museums, it's not assumed that you'll develop physical exhibitions. Instead, audience engagement becomes the core, which other teams start to support. And the museum becomes a fluid space. If it's a performance venue, is it a cooking school, is it a dining hall, a space for therapy? So with that in mind, now that we've established what is a museum without a collection, why should we have one? What are the implications of eliminating object-based collections and what are the benefits? For me, the answer to this really crystallized during the 4A Curators Intensive program, and specifically a topic which we had on sustainable curating. 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art has a climate active carbon neutral certification for organisations which it achieved in 2018 to 19. This here is a recent report from the calendar year of 2020. As you can see highlighted in yellow, freight and air transport were the biggest emitters. So during this talk from the 4A Curators Intensive program, it really got me thinking about travelling international exhibitions with physical artworks. What are the ramifications of that on climate change? And I got a first-hand experience about this when we go to the next slide with the transportation of boba well, which is one of my artworks, a 1.5 meter ceramic well. It's so heavy and so cumbersome to move. From packaging, transporting, and storing large objects, for this one, it really got me thinking about what happens if you don't sell a work? What happens to this object in its life cycle? In this case, at the moment, it's in the garage collecting dust. So for this one object, what are the ramifications for a collection with masses of large objects? I also came across a practice of Ruth Jushui Lee, who is a ceramic artist. In here, we have a demonstration of Ruth in Taiwan, and she makes the sculpture on the spot, and gradually it disappears with, I think there's a water droplet at the top which disintegrates over time. So from Ruth's practice, I really started to imagine, what about if we had traveling shows which were instead instructions? So you remake it at every single location. The implications of this is that you'd be embedded in a system of funding, training local makers, working with local suppliers, and transferring tacit knowledge. So with that in mind, what does a curator actually do in a museum without collections? In my opinion, curators start to employ human-centered design and design thinking. As a marketing tutor at UNSW, I taught my students about the transferability of skills in consumer-centric innovation in other industries. And just like that with museums, I think we can apply that as well. If we apply the principles of design thinking to the museum framework, we start to think about who is your consumer that you're empathizing with. And in that case, it might be maybe your mother, maybe a local community member, it might be your staff members. So my model for employing design thinking to museums is that in-house curators suddenly become empathetic producers to consumers and users who are part of your grassroots communities. And I've tried to employ that currently with my project Chufan, which Megan mentioned earlier. In Chufan, this is a culinary database tracing the intimate stories and migration of family recipes in the contested Chinese diaspora. For this project, I'm employing a focus group of young adults who identify with the Chinese diaspora community and using their input to guide the direction of Chufan and the value which they get from it. So here you can kind of see a variety of different doors, and these are all the young people who are making submissions and will help me to guide the direction of the project. This here is the kind of basic version which I've put together. If it's a video, hopefully you can play, but if not. So what this is what I call a minimum viable product. It's something which I'll use to test with the focus group, and it really empathizes. I'll use the knowledge with this to guide the direction of the project. The key mantras which I love from design thinking: fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And secondly, fail early, fail often. So if we apply this to museums in the way we do programming, the way we put together what we actually offer to people, how revolutionary would that be? So just to recap the talk which I went from today, just to recap the talk from today, what is a museum without a collection? In my opinion, it becomes a space for cultural exchanges between grassroots communities. Why should we have one? To minimize the impact on climate change and think of ourselves as responsible and organizations working from a systemic angle. Finally, what is the role of a curator inside this sort of museum? We become empathetic designers and producers for grassroots community members. But if I wanted to give you some kind of tangible next steps, the first one would be to amplify the voices of independent curators. Relinquish your control from in-house curators to empower local independent curators with operational and financial support. When you're choosing these curators, choose curators who are market mavens or leaders who are embedded with the fabric of grassroots communities and understand the contemporary realities of what they're going through. So in here you kind of see curator and curatorial audience engagement, and it's how you're working with the system. The second tangible step I'll leave you guys with: recalibrate museum strategies, KPIs, and operations. So to really ensure that we embed the voices of independent curators, it really has to go through these three elements, not just in terms of engaging a translator, but trying to put this into systematic operations that we have. So what this might look like is that if you're engaging primary research to understand your museum audiences, you're engaging in observational studies, fieldwork, focus groups, and you're properly remunerating community advisors. And lastly, what I'll leave you with, try to consider de-sessioning, digitizing, and collating collections. So de-sessioning, what is relevant to contemporary communities which you're serving today? Digitizing, what objects are deteriorating but beyond the ability to be interpreted? And finally, collation, how can organizations from local to regional to state, how can we forge alliances? So for example, if we had one time-based conservator, maybe they can be specialized and we can have them all in the same location to reduce the amount of storage facilities that we need. So in conclusion, this talk is my hope for the future of museums. Thank you.